Did you ever stop to think that the very idea of a nation-state, those solid blocks on our world map, might have been fundamentally shaped by something as, well, tangible as debt?
It is quite a thought, isn't it?
Yeah, it's kind of a mind bender. Suggests our national identities are maybe intertwined with financial obligations stretching way, way back.
And what's really fascinating here is that today's deep dive goes right into that origin story. We're using Jonathan Hall's work, The Unfinished History of the Indebted Nation-State. And Hall makes this really compelling case that the competitive world of nation-states we see today is, well, the long-term result of states constantly needing to borrow money.
Exactly. So our mission for you today, listener, is to unpack this whole relationship. It's quite intricate.
It is.
You want to give you a kind of shortcut to understanding how debt played this foundational role, tracing it all the way from, like, feudal times up to our modern global economy.
We're aiming for those aha moments,
Totally. The kind that suddenly makes sense of today's headlines.
And if you connect this to the bigger picture, you'll see how this history touches on a whole range of things. Some quite surprising, actually.
Like what sort of things?
Well, our conversation will get into feudal Europe, obviously, but also the rise of capitalism, imperialism, and even the historical roots of antisemitism, how that connects to this whole story of debt.
Wow. Okay. Quite the scope. So let's dive in. Hall starts off by looking at what he calls the pre-capitalist double bind. Can you maybe paint a picture of that for us?
Yeah.
Early feudal Europe.
Sure. So Hall leans on Perry Anderson here, who described feudalism in Europe as this parcelization of sovereignty. Basically, power wasn't central.
Right. It was spread out.
Exactly. Spread out among loads of landowners, often fighting each other. Think local lords, not a big central king initially. Norbert Elias points out this was just constant warfare between these guys. Land was everything.
Okay, so constant fighting over land. Where does the double bind bit come in then?
The double bind. Hall says it was this paradox, right? To get followers, to get loyalty, successful warlords had to give out land rights.
Makes sense. You need soldiers.
But by giving away land, they actually weakened their own central power. Because those followers could then become rivals themselves, the king being just the first among equals. That idea captures it. Very precarious.
Right. Sounds inherently unstable, like a recipe for just endless conflict. So how did they get out of it?
Well, the way out, according to Hall, was the gradual monetization of society, basically using money more.
Money.
Rulers started relying more and more on borrowing from people involved in long-distance trade. Elias even noted how early on, like with William the Conqueror's son, the fact lords could mint their own coins showed a shift away from just land being power.
Okay, and this is where it gets really interesting, isn't it? Because relying on borrowing, that must have had some big consequences.
Yeah. Huge consequences. Precisely. This solution, borrowing money, meant these emerging rulers became subordinate to their creditors, often international creditors.
So they solved one problem, the local rivals maybe.
But became dependent on this other power, a financial power that operated across borders, arguably even more powerful in the long run.
Okay, moving on then. Hall talks about this symbiotic relationship of market and state.
Yeah.
How did that develop from just borrowing from traders?
Well, part of it was this shift, like with the Normans. They went from being, Viking raiders to actually settling down, owning land.
Right.
But the competition between these feudal lords didn't stop.
Yeah.
And that competition kept fueling the need to borrow, which in turn strengthened the lords who were better at accessing and managing finance. It helped them centralize power against their rivals.
So the state, or the emerging state, and the merchants, they kind of started needing each other.
Exactly. It became mutually dependent. Merchants needed the state for legal frameworks, enforcing contracts, cutting through all the different local feudal rules, protection for their trade.
And the state?
They needed the merchants for the cash.
Yeah.
Especially for funding wars and expanding their territory. It was a real give and take.
Okay, crucial question then. Where did the actual money come from to pay back these big debts?
Right. That's the key point and often missed. These rulers, they weren't just landowners, they were borrowers. And they repaid the debts using the surplus they squeezed out of the peasants.
Through things like serfdom.
Taxes.
Serfdom, taxation, yeah. That's where the repayment funds came from. And this fundamental link, the territorial state needing money, often from financial powers outside its borders, Hall argues that persists, even today.
Wow.
Yeah, even with modern capitalism. The supposedly sovereign nation-state is still, in many ways, reliant on international money power.
Okay, this brings us to a really quite disturbing part of the story Hall explores, the connection between nation-state formation and anti-Semitism. He uses Abram Leon's work here.
Yes, Abram Leon's The Jewish Question. It's a powerful argument. Leon basically suggests that anti-Semitism is deeply tangled up with the rise of the nation-state.
How so?
Well, he argues that Jewish long-distance traders initially played this really vital role. They were the ones financing the early feudal rulers, providing the money needed for the early state to function and grow.
But that changed, didn't it? And that shift is linked to the rise of anti-Semitism as this systemic thing.
Exactly. As larger Christian banks and financial networks started developing, they gradually pushed out the Jewish lenders. Leon argues that anti-Semitism then emerged as this systemic ideology, persecution, expulsion.
Wow.
And this happened alongside the growth of mercantile capitalism. Partly, maybe it was a way to distract from the state's continued dependence on finance just by scapegoating one specific group.
Hall mentions a symbiotic relationship between the aristocracy and Jewish merchants, but also hostile. How did that work?
Yeah, it was complex. Mutual hostility, definitely. The landowners often looked down on the merchants, but they also really depended on them for loans and financial services.
So interdependence, but laced with contempt.
Pretty much. Leon describes Jews as a kind of people class. Their historical circumstances meant they filled this necessary role as lenders in feudal society.
And that role made them vulnerable, especially when Christian bankers started taking over.
Extremely vulnerable. Jewish creditors often ended up acting as tax collectors for the rulers, too.
Oh, that's never a popular job.
Never. So that put them in a very visible, often resented position with the general population. And the awful myth of the Jewish bloodsucker that intensified as lending spread more widely, even to peasants.
And this ideology just kept going.
It persisted, yeah. It kind of transformed the abstract, sometimes invisible power of capital into these imagined hidden figures pulling the strings, which in turn, as Benedict Anderson talked about, undermines the whole idea of a unified, imagined community for the nation-state.
Okay, this really sets a dark stage for the next part.
Yeah.
Purification and paranoia. Ethnic cleansing. You mentioned the Spanish Inquisition earlier. How does that fit this pattern of debt and nation building?
The Spanish Inquisition post-1492 is just a brutal example. It shows this drive for religious unity, for everyone to be the same.
Right.
But it also goes hand in hand with denying the state's actual dependence on this transnational money power. You know, the expulsion or forced conversion of Jews and Moors created this society where many people were hiding their true identities, the conversos.
So this intense push for everyone to be the same actually created more suspicion and paranoia?
Absolutely. This constant need to unmask suspected secret Jews or Muslims, it bred intense paranoia. It led to concepts like pureza de sangre, purity of blood. Yeah. And Francisco de Quevedo's supposed idea of an international Jewish conspiracy, that's an early, terrifying example of this kind of thinking taking root.
And all this paranoia and violence was happening just as Spain was actually getting richer.
Right.
From the Americas.
Exactly. The huge influx of money after 1492, the money that funded Columbus and the colonization, happened at the same time as this reactionary violence intensified. Jewish financiers, like the Ravia brothers, were actually crucial in supporting the Spanish monarchs.
Who are also heavily indebted to them, presumably.
Deeply indebted. It's this profound contradiction.
Wealth flooding in, but also this deep paranoia and persecution.
Yes. And paradoxically, Spain actually became poorer in some ways. All that gold and silver from the Americas caused massive inflation.
Hurting ordinary people.
Yeah, peasants, artisans, they suffered. Fernand Braudel even pointed out how the Seville Exchange, the center of commerce, and the Escorial Palace were designed by the same architect. A kind of symbol, maybe, of this tension between the market and the state.
And the anti-Semitic violence.
In that context, Hall suggests it served the interests of a feudal aristocracy that felt threatened by the rise of capitalism. A desperate, doomed reaction, really.
Okay, let's shift focus slightly. Hall talks about imperial legality versus its adventuring warlords. How did this tension between established rules and these powerful individuals, plus the ever-present need for money-shaped empires?
Well, imperial expansion, especially thinking about Latin America, it ran on that same basic engine we've been discussing, warlordism and money power working together, sometimes clashing.
Right.
The figure of the caudillo, the strongman leader, he kind of represents a return to older forms of personal power, especially after the official legal structures of the Spanish Empire started to crumble.
So even when you had these imperial laws on the books, these powerful local figures could just rise up and take charge.
Yes, exactly. Think about what Edwin Williamson and Roberto González Echevarria described the struggles of the newly independent Latin American nations. The old Spanish laws were there, but often you had these powerful rural caudillos emerging, challenging the new central governments. Sarmiento's book, Facundo, his complex picture of the barbaric caudillo, really captures that tension.
And Hall links this to a kind of social unconscious coming out during these revolutions. What's he mean by that?
He's drawing on Sarmiento there. The idea is that the caudillo represented this sort of raw, maybe primal force within society, something that had been perhaps suppressed or hidden under imperial rule, and then it burst out during the upheavals of revolution, like the return of something repressed from the past.
And this connects to Marx's famous observation about bourgeois hypocrisy.
Precisely. Marx's point about how bourgeois civilization, so respectable at home, often went naked, showed its brutal side in the colonies.
Hmm.
The return of the warlord figure, even later, maybe someone like Franco in Spain during a crisis, Hall suggests this reveals a kind of hidden truth about imperial culture itself.
And crises often trigger this, like losing colonies or war debts.
Crises after major conflicts, losing colonies, massive war debts, think Spain after 1898 or Germany after World War I. These moments often saw a surge in nationalism and frequently anti-Semitic ideologies as a way to explain the loss, the hardship, the frustrated emissions.
Okay, so finally, Hall moves from all this history to what he calls the revolutionary transitional demand. He mentions the political Marxists. How does this whole history of indebted states feed into this idea of a transitional demand?
Well, he acknowledges the insights of people like Ellen Meiksins Wood and Robert Brenner, the political Marxists, who really focus on how market competition forces certain behaviors.
Right, market compulsion.
Yeah. But Hall argues they maybe don't focus enough on state debt. On this ongoing, often contradictory relationship, this symbiosis between the market and the indebted state. He notes even critics like Nieves and Nisansioglu sometimes overlook this specific angle.
And this ongoing problem of debt,
Mhm.
it has big implications for thinking about changing the system.
Huge implications. Hall stresses how relevant rentier capitalism still is, making money from owning things rather than producing things, and how the lines between old-style landlordism and modern capitalism are getting blurrier.
Okay.
And he makes this point that nationalism, kind of paradoxically, often ends up propping up international capitalism
Oh.
by legitimizing the state, using its power, its coercive power to enforce the claims of creditors. And even the most dominant nations, the big imperial powers, they aren't truly independent from international finance. Think IMF, the ECB, the Federal Reserve. They still hold sway.
So what's the transitional demand Hall suggests comes out of understanding all this?
He draws on Trotsky's idea of demands that bridge the gap. Demands that go beyond just asking for small reforms, but actually challenge the core logic of the system.
Okay.
And given how widespread debt is state debt, personal debt, global debt, Hall argues that the abolition of interest-bearing debt should be a key transitional demand.
Abolishing debt itself.
Abolishing interest-bearing debt, yeah. It directly tackles a core mechanism of capitalist accumulation. It's not just tinkering, it's aiming at the foundations. He finishes by echoing Marx that humanity only really sets itself tasks it can solve when the conditions are actually ripe for change.
Right. So, wrapping up our deep dive today, the main takeaway seems to be that the indebted nation-state isn't some recent issue. It's got these incredibly deep historical roots.
Absolutely. Roots that still shape global power today, often in ways we don't immediately see.
And hopefully for you listening, understanding this history gives you a new lens, a different way to look at current events. Things like national debt crises, economic turmoil, even why certain harmful ideologies just seem to stick around.
Exactly. It provides a much richer context, I think.
And it definitely leaves you with a provocative thought. If the nation-state itself was essentially born from debt, can we ever be truly sovereign until that relationship is fundamentally challenged or changed? Knowing this history, how does it shift how you view international finance and national politics?
It's certainly a lot to think about.
Definitely gives you food for thought.
Indeed. And perhaps we can explore some related avenues in future deep dives.